Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Always have to make sure of that. Anybody who joins late will just have the Chief Market Analyst at the Economic Alliance of Greater Baltimore, and I'm joined today by Jeffrey Wells of the Maryland Department of Business and Economic Development and the Executive Director of Cyber Development over at DBED. Jeffrey is going to help provide some context and information about the state's cybersecurity industry as we go through that portion of the presentation to provide a little bit of additional information that I might not be able to give. He's got a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge in this industry, so we're very happy to have him on. Before that, we're going to run through an update of the regional economy. And at any time, if you have a question or want some more information, there's a chat box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Go ahead and type in that question, and I or Jeffrey will do our very best to answer your question as best we can. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Greater Baltimore is home to nearly 2.75 million people, making it one of the 25 largest U.S. metros. Recent population growth has been relatively slow compared to the fastest growing regions in the country. We're only growing 19th fastest and slightly slower than the U.S. But as you can see, that's pretty typical of other Northeast corridor metros. You see New York is right below us, Pittsburgh is even slower, and Boston is only slightly faster than the U.S. average. We do have, though, a pretty significant change in the population of 25 to 34-year-olds, especially educated with a college degree, 25 to 34-year-olds. And it's very important to track this influx of young professionals, or so-called millennials, because this is going to be the workforce moving forward. By 2020, millennials are going to make up almost 50% of the workforce nationally. So the metropolitan area that sort of wins that battle now and gets those young professionals in has a better chance of having that stock of well-educated professionals just a few years from now. As you can see, Washington, D.C. is definitely one of the fastest growing in terms of this young population and this young educated population among these Northeast Corridor metropolitan areas. In general, Baltimore is one of the best educated metropolitan areas in the country. You can see we're 8th overall in percentage of the population with a bachelor's degree or higher, and 4th overall with a percentage of the population with a graduate degree or higher. Just a quick note about these numbers. This is from the American Community Survey's one-year estimates. They're very current, but they're not necessarily as accurate as the 3- and 5-year estimates. So there might be some revisions up or down as those come out a little bit later in the year. Greater Baltimore unemployment right now stands at about 7%, which is above the U.S. average for the first time, as you can see, in the last 3 years, at least in the quarters that we track here. And it's sort of been bouncing around, generally not very stable. There was a couple periods around 7%, a couple periods around 6%, but we're back up. And I attribute a lot of that to sequestration and some of the effects being seen there, but it's certainly not the end-all be-all, because Maryland's figures for unemployment in August were just revised down. So it wouldn't be surprising to see Baltimore's numbers being revised down a little bit later as well as September figures come out. It's probably not surprising when you see that 7% unemployment to find out that employment growth has been relatively slow over the last year, 2.10%, which is better than it was in the last quarter over the last year. Still faster than the U.S. average, but it's not at the rate of growth that we've seen in areas like San Diego, San Francisco, a lot of southern and West Coast metropolitan regions. So, when you see that overall figure, you start to wonder, where is the growth coming from, or what's holding the region back in terms of employment growth? And the answer really is we see a lot of growth in these cyclical industries, ones that rely on relatively good weather, like leisure and hospitality, and or construction as well, but also on greater economic trends. again, leisure and hospitality and construction. Frankly, people aren't going on vacation or doing any tourist activities if they're not confident in the economy overall. So it's good to see those at the top. That's very promising. What you don't like to see, especially in Baltimore, is having the federal government so far down the list and actually losing employees over the last year. Now, this isn't the rate of loss of employment that we saw in May, which was around -4% growth in federal employment, but it still hurts to see a negative, a loss of employment in the federal government, especially when you look at the 10-year figures and see that the federal government has been the second fastest, has experienced the second fastest growth of employment in the Greater Baltimore region over that decade. We also see educational services and professional, scientific, and technical services among the industries that are growing faster than the average. Very promising as well. Those are strong foundational industries, knowledge industries. They're they're generally high wage and high growth everywhere around the country. So seeing them there is indicative of a good foundation for our economy moving forward. Another quick note about this seasonal employment. As you can see, that amusement, gambling, and recreation one has the biggest curve as you change seasons, with the highest being in July, August, highest level employment being in July and August. And then as you get into the winter months, sort of dipping down before coming back up as the weather warms up. So there might be a slight drop off as the August numbers are revised and September and October numbers come out. But otherwise, everything else that we're seeing here, food service, construction, accommodation, all have relatively small dips in the winter in the winter months. But then retail trade bumps up a little bit as well, and that's a big employer. So hopefully, a bump in retail trade can sort of cancel out whatever minor dips we see in food service, construction, and accommodation. Despite that loss of employment in the federal government, that federal government employer is still the most densely concentrated employment industry, so to speak, in the Greater Baltimore region. There's almost twice as many people in this area working for the federal government as you would expect based on national averages. But after that, again, we see these high wage, high growth sectors that are commonly associated or called knowledge industries or next economy industries. The educational services, professional, scientific, and technical services, and healthcare and social assistance industries. So it's very good to see those. Again, it's a strong foundation for us to be building on. This was a pretty cool project that was done by LinkedIn, and I wanted to highlight it not because it's necessarily indicative of future growth. It's more of a measure of what industry is your region known for. What jobs are the most common, or excuse me, what skills are the most common showing up on LinkedIn, and what jobs necessarily do they relate to? Baltimore is one of 6 metropolitan areas across the country that is best known, based on the folks who are on LinkedIn, for the computer industry. There's a higher density of people listing skills on their profile that indicate work in the computer industry, and like I said, we're one of 6, along with Seattle, San Francisco, Austin, Kansas City, and Cedar Rapids. I guess Cedar Rapids is a little bit smaller, but other than that, those are all very well-known tech centers. So to be a part of security, so more or less cybersecurity, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. But after that, it was military, life sciences, healthcare management, and then counterterrorism. So certainly runs the gamut, and all of those can obviously be combined when you start talking about health IT and cybersecurity of electronic medical records. But I thought it was pretty cool that Maryland has a number of people, a density of people with skills in both the computer industry and in that healthcare and life sciences industry. Baltimore is also one of the 5 wealthiest metropolitan areas by both median household income and per capita income. The average households earn almost $70,000 annually, which is a terrific income for families in the region. And because of that high income, those well-compensated employees benefit even more from a relatively affordable region. Homes in Greater Baltimore are less expensive than they are in other large metros. And while they're still 12th out of the top 25 metropolitan regions, you can see here, this is actually second quarter 2014. There's still significantly, homes in this region are still significantly less expensive than they are in Boston, New York, Washington, D.C. And as you can see, there's a really big drop off between San Francisco and San Diego, and then even San Diego and Los Angeles after that. So those well compensated individuals here can, their money goes a little bit farther than it might in a more expensive metropolitan region. And according to Trulia, you can see that there's very slow growth in home prices over the last year and over the last 3 years. According to Trulia, home prices are tracking very much with jobs growth over the last year. So with a relatively slow jobs growth that we just talked about, it's probably not as surprising to see slow home price growth over the last year, but hopefully that'll change as sequestration is sort of taken into effect. Things sort of settle down a little bit, and more employers can begin to hire in what might be a new environment, a new hiring environment for them. Just a couple things I want to point out on this venture capital update. First is that Maryland is capturing a large majority of biotechnology venture capital that has entered the DC Metroplex region, which is Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. So there's certainly a strength in Maryland there. And second is that software, it's easily the hottest industry right now for venture capital investment. And the region's on pace to break $2 billion for the first time since that 1997 to 2001 period, sort of that advent of the commercial internet. So while we might be behind a little bit of San Francisco, for example, in terms of venture capital acquisition, it's certainly better than it was just a few years ago. I want to just check with everybody. Are you still able to hear me? Okay, great. Getting a note that I'm back. So awesome. Glad to hear that. I hope I didn't go out on everybody. We also want to highlight a couple of recent rankings where Maryland and Greater Baltimore has been prominently featured. First is that Columbia and Ellicott City were rated the number 6 best place to live by CNN Money Magazine. Towson also ranked in the top 50 there. So we've got 2 towns in Greater Baltimore that are considered excellent places to live. I can't disagree with either of them. I think they're both fantastic. On another similar list, Towson was rated the number 42 best place to live in America and was the only Greater Baltimore town to be listed among a top 100 list. So certainly we've got some excellent suburbs for growing up, for raising a family, for living in general. Those are both awesome places with very cool main streets, very walkable areas. So definitely the right live, work, play urban environment there. There are three suburbs from Greater Baltimore on the list of best suburbs for education: Ellicott City, Columbia, Maryland, and Towson. And then finally, Baltimore is ranked number 5 on the top 10 college destinations list. And that takes everything into account from the density of college students here to the opportunity that students have after college, both to get a job and what they'd be earning afterwards. So certainly an awesome place to live, awesome place to raise a family, and an awesome place to learn and to go to school. And a couple of great headlines from the last quarter. It was very difficult to pick just 4 to share with you. In our quarterly economic update, you'll be able to see the full almost 20 probably that have come out just in the last 3 months. Governor O'Malley and Lieutenant Governor Brown kicked off the 3rd annual Invest Maryland Challenge. Winning companies will receive $100,000 in grants plus a number of support, pro bono support services from a number of accounting firms and the like around the region. So it's a huge help when a company can knock that out of the park and win that competition. And then the Downtown Partnership also launched a new technology company initiative to help move small and medium tech businesses to that downtown core business district area. I thought this was a really cool incentive program. This is the kind of thing I felt like maybe 5 or 10 years ago we would have heard about in like an Austin or a San Diego or a Seattle, and said, wow, that's really cool. I wish we could do something like that here. And now to see it happening here, I think is fantastic. I think it's ahead of the curve, and I expect and hope that it does very well. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to our report on cybersecurity. It's been updated this year to include 2013 information and the state of Maryland as well. So now that we have a good sense of what the region is doing as a whole, sort of a benchmarking, we can take a deeper look into this growing and very important industry in the region. And Jeffrey, I again invite you to text and anything that we're talking about. And of course, if there's any questions about cybersecurity, please feel free to type them into the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. As a quick introduction, there are three things that seem to come up over and over as we talk about cybersecurity. And it's important to remember that these three things sort of shape everything in the industry. First, our data is everywhere now. It's in our pockets, it's on our desks, it's in our dentist's office when we go and maintain an electronic health record there. It's very convenient. It helps things move along a lot faster. It's very productive, but it does allow our information to be compromised more often and maybe more easily than it has been ever in the past. In fact, 97 Fortune 100 companies have acknowledged that they have been breached in cyber hacks, and the odds show that the other three that haven't admitted to it probably have been hacked and just don't know it yet. It sometimes takes a little while for companies to recognize that that's even happening. And finally, this is a rapidly changing industry. There are very fast technological advances. There are constantly these new endpoints popping up. A new iPad or tablets coming out not even that long ago, and suddenly becoming so ubiquitous that it creates this additional endpoint that needs to be protected. And there are new occupational demands every day because of changing technology and because of these new hardware endpoints, so to speak. So what we call cybersecurity today, and what we can talk about quantitatively today, looks like even 5 or 10 years from now. There might be a totally new technology. There might be totally new classifications of jobs that we haven't even imagined yet, just because the requirements for this work change so much and become so specific as we move forward.
Patrick, this is Jeffrey. I will just add, it may not even look like that in 6 months. Everything is changing so fast. So, looking out 5 to 10 years, I imagine it's going to be drastically different. But I would say in 6 months to a year, it will be even unrecognizable compared to what we see today.
Certainly, and all it takes is for one new piece of technology that everyone latches onto, like an iPad or an iPhone, that suddenly is everywhere. And like you said, Jeffrey, the industry is entirely different just a few months into the future. A quick summary of this of the report: we found that Greater Baltimore and the state of Maryland have very fluid labor forces. The fact is that Baltimore sits right next to DC and can easily let people commute between the two. And Maryland, as a geographically smaller state and sitting in this densely packed mid-Atlantic area, people can go from Virginia to Maryland, or DC to Maryland, or even Delaware through Maryland to work every day, which allows for these educated professionals to live in a wider geographic area and still work in this industry or collaborate with people in this industry, and come into either Maryland or DC as we talk about this commuting pattern every single day. There are over 77,000 skilled cybersecurity professionals in the Greater Baltimore metropolitan region. And then, as we'll show, this commuting pattern, this very fluid commuting pattern, but when you include that Baltimore, Washington whole corridor, there's over 211,000 cybersecurity professionals. Greater Baltimore and Maryland are among the best educated areas in the country, as we've already described. But we also have colleges that continue to produce high quality graduates in these STEM fields that are so desperately needed to continue filling jobs in the cybersecurity industry. 5 Maryland universities are recognized as centers of excellence in information assurance and cyber defense education and research, which is the NSA's new designation for cybersecurity education in 2- and 4-year institutions. And all of these things are wonderful, but there can also sometimes be a lag in capturing venture capital related to cybersecurity. It's not necessarily limited. That issue isn't necessarily limited to cybersecurity, but it is something to be mindful of as we move forward and try and find ways to continue helping to grow and push this industry forward. Very quick geography lesson. The Baltimore MSA, the metropolitan part of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and then green down at the bottom is Virginia. But as you can see, that long border running between Baltimore and Washington, it might be a defined boundary as far as the MSA goes, but people that live there and work around there don't see that as it's not a barrier. There's very easy travel between those areas. And sometimes the DC and Baltimore areas can really function as one much larger metropolitan region, also known as a combined statistical area. So this is the commuting patterns between Greater Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So you can see Baltimore, people from Baltimore travel to, or excuse me, 150,000 people from Baltimore travel to the Maryland, D.C. suburbs every day for work, and then almost 110,000 go from the D.C. suburbs back out to Baltimore. So there's a very easy swap of professionals going from these regions as you break them down. And what that really allows, like I keep saying, is for Baltimore and Washington to operate as one super metropolitan region, so to speak. It's fair to count all of these professionals all in the same place because it really is easy for them to collaborate. You're a relatively short car ride from one another. It's easy to work together, to meet, to bump into each other at tech-focused networking events. Maryland's much the same way. It's a relatively small and residents to travel for work or for leisure, which allows for a lot more of these collisions, what economists like to call them, when people in the same industry meet each other and share ideas and basically solve problems together. It's a lot easier when you have this density and ease of transportation around the area. It's also easy for businesses to distribute around the region and around the East Coast. Not necessarily as important for a tech-based industry that might deal more in software than it does in product, but it's certainly something to be mindful of. A few years ago, the CTIC put out a report with the Able Foundation, I believe, that estimated that there were 13,393 jobs in cybersecurity that were available open in the region, and that there were a total of 19,413 available jobs in the state of Maryland. This is a rough estimate shown here, but if these jobs were filled by 2020, so so not people moving from one job in the region to another job in the region, the region would see an additional $3.9 billion in output, and the state itself would see an additional $5.9 billion in output if all of these jobs were filled with people that didn't already live here. So remember, this is a very rough estimate. It takes into consideration that or it doesn't take into consideration people changing jobs and really just shifting their own productivity. This is really a new 19,000 people coming into the area, making the median for the industry, which probably isn't necessarily going to be the case. But it's easy to see that this is a very productive industry. People are very well paid that work in this industry, and adding another, let's say 20,000 for round figures, 20,000 people working in cybersecurity to the state of Maryland would be a tremendous impact. It would be terrific to see that output and that labor income, both from the direct the indirect, which is all of the second-party vendors that industry would hire, and then the induced work, which is employees from the cybersecurity industry then spending their money on typical household goods. That additional 20,000 employees would be tremendous for Greater Baltimore.
This is Jeffrey again. I would just add that the definition used for the Able Foundation for these numbers were based on very traditional IT-focused cybersecurity related jobs. So it's it's not did not take into consideration the evolution of those jobs, nor the jobs of the future that nobody knows about yet.
That's a good point. There are certainly many aspects to cybersecurity that, when this report was put out just a few years ago, might not have existed then, might not have been considered cybersecurity then, and there might even be more jobs available right now, like Jeffrey said, with a wider scope of what cybersecurity is. So it's important to keep in mind that filling these jobs with qualified professionals is of the utmost importance. It would be fantastic to see this sort of impact on the region and the state. Maryland is already rich with cyber employers. The 10 largest are listed here. As you can see, it's a lot of traditional government contractors with very significant cyber and IT operations. And the 10 most common cyber job titles are listed here on as well. This is from the UMUC's website. So like Jeffrey continues to point out, it's important to remember that these job titles might not be relevant job titles in a couple months or a couple years, and they might not have even existed a couple months or a couple years before UMUC put this list together. And this list did help inform our work as far as researching employees and what occupations people are working in here in Greater Baltimore. But you'll notice that they don't match up one-to-one necessarily with what we're talking about when we show a table of employees in Greater Baltimore, because the BLS sometimes defines things, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, sometimes defines things under slightly different occupational titles than someone in like UMUC who's specifically focused on cyber, or at least in this department would. Greater Baltimore and Maryland are among the most densely concentrated markets with cyber professionals, with nearly 50% more cybersecurity workers than would be suggested based on the national average. And Baltimore is actually more dense, while it's a much smaller area. We said 77,000 people working in Greater Baltimore in cybersecurity versus 211,000 across that DC Baltimore area. So a much smaller, but because Baltimore is a smaller area than Washington, D.C. or the Baltimore-Washington corridor is overall, it's actually more dense with cybersecurity professionals than that greater combined statistical area is. So here's an occupational breakdown of cybersecurity employees in the Greater Baltimore and Baltimore-Washington regions. The reason we use this occupational employment comparison is because industry definitions group people based on this type of companies that they work at. So someone who is a computer and information research scientist or an information security analyst at a bank, at a finance firm, would be lumped into financial activities under this industry comparison. But we want to know how many people are working in jobs that relate to cybersecurity, whether it's protecting a network or protecting the information about you that the bank stores. Because that sort of ability is what transfers to other jobs in cybersecurity. It doesn't necessarily matter where you're working now. What the subject matter is that you're working on. So that's why we use occupation instead of industry here. Second, there's 42,515 cybersecurity professionals in Greater Baltimore by itself, and then you add in that Central Maryland region, there's 77,506. And then keep in mind that Baltimore and DC are close enough to share a workforce in many aspects, and cybersecurity is certainly one of them. Together, the Greater Baltimore and DC metropolitan area, that corridor, has about a little over 210,000 cybersecurity professionals. And to help you envision what that looks like geographically and comparatively, we put together this map, and you can see that there's a strong string of density in cybersecurity up that northeast corridor from Washington, D.C. all the way up to Boston. Baltimore, I'm going to pull up an arrow right here. Baltimore's right there above Washington, D.C. Slightly smaller bubble than Washington, D.C., but roughly the same size or slightly bigger than a number of those other dense area green bubbles going up the Northeast Corridor. And that's really the only place in the country where you see that concentration of people in metropolitan areas that are so close to each other. And that's why it's so important that Baltimore is well connected, in addition to being close to Washington, D.C., is that for someone in cybersecurity in Baltimore that wants to work with someone, let's say in New York or in Boston, it's relatively easy for them to get there. You don't have to go nearly as far as you might from one of these other areas around the country. And then when we talk about Maryland, Maryland has 82,735 cybersecurity professionals, including over 25,000 software developers. And like we said not too long ago, and when we talked about venture capital, software is a very hot area for investment. So seeing that many people working in software development is a good sign. DC by itself has over 21,000 cybersecurity professionals, and then there's significantly more in Northern Virginia. And again, to help envision what that looks like nationally, we put together this map. DC is not pictured, but there is a small green dot in between Maryland and Virginia there. But again, you can see there's a density, and now the density is more concentrated in that mid-Atlantic area between Virginia, DC, and Maryland. And a lot of that has to do with the federal government, yes, but it also means wonderful things for the cybersecurity companies that exist here, because again, they really don't have to go all that far to collaborate with one another or for people to share ideas and to work together to solve whatever new problems pop up in the cybersecurity industry. California, as a whole state, has a lower density, still above average. But the only other places that we see an above average density of cybersecurity professionals is in Washington, Colorado, and then up in Massachusetts. Wages for cybersecurity professionals in Greater Baltimore are high relative to the all industry median, but they're competitive with the wages that are being paid in other dense cybersecurity markets. It's less expensive, for example, to pay a cybersecurity employee the median cyber wage in Baltimore than it is in Boston, DC, and similar to what it is in Denver. So while these are terrific wages, and like we said, they can afford a terrific quality of life here in Baltimore, it's less expensive for a company when you're looking at total dollar amounts to employ people in Baltimore than it is in some of these other areas. And the same story is true when you look at Maryland. Wages are very competitive, but they are often less expensive than they are in other dense cybersecurity states. For example, very close between Maryland and Virginia, but Maryland is less expensive than California and Washington State are, at least as it goes for employing cybersecurity professionals. We discussed earlier the rate of educational attainment in Greater Baltimore, but I also wanted to point out the rate of educational attainment in the state of Maryland. Maryland actually ranks even better than Baltimore does when you're looking at the whole state. Fourth in terms of the percentage of the population with a bachelor's degree or higher. Baltimore ranked eighth, for context, and Maryland ranks third with a percentage of the population with a professional or a graduate degree. Baltimore ranked fourth, again, just for context. So there's a dense cybersecurity market here and a number of highly educated professionals. There's a density of educated professionals as well. And in addition to that dense labor force, Maryland has a strong pipeline of STEM students that could easily enter the cybersecurity force and make an impact right away. Uh, that includes nearly 35,000 students in technology degree programs, or 35,000 graduating over the last 4 years from technology degree programs in the state of Maryland, and then another over 56,000 in STEM degree fields in college just in 2011 alone. So there's definitely a very strong pipeline to keep that cybersecurity industry rolling along. Where the Baltimore-Washington corridor sort of falls back is in this venture capital attainment and availability. The DC Metroplex area is larger than the Boston, New England area, for example, but only captures about 50% of the venture capital that Boston does. And as you can see, falls far short of what Silicon Valley captures, though that's speaks as much to what goes on in Silicon Valley as it does in the DC Metroplex area. There's a great, there's a number of venture capital deals being made in the Baltimore Washington area, but it would be nice if Baltimore Washington was sort of on that same pace with maybe.
Trick, just a
Where
quick question on that the clarification on the previous slide. That is total venture capital, not necessarily just on purely cybersecurity products, right?
It's not necessarily on purely cybersecurity, but it is limited to information technology,
Information
networking and equipment,
technology.
and software cybersecurity.
Okay.
So the three like investment industries, so to speak, that relate the most to cybersecurity is what we're looking at right here.
Okay. Yeah. So it's much broader. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Yep. But where Baltimore and Maryland do shine is in university research and development. Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore City spends more on computer science R&D, and this is computer science and mathematics research and development expenditures. Johns Hopkins University spends more than any other university in the country, nearly $137 million just in that field for R&D. Maryland spends the fourth most, and excuse me, Maryland spends fourth most on university R&D as a full state, despite being a much smaller state than the other ones listed there in that top five. So certainly a great state for researching computer science and mathematics, which, like Jeffrey pointed out, is not strictly cybersecurity, but any cybersecurity R&D expenditure is going to fall into this math and computer science. So um, while it's not a one-to-one, so to speak, it's fair to assume, at least in my opinion, that the money shown here indicates that this is a great region and cybersecurity research at universities. I apologize for this being a little bit small, but I wanted to show this on a per capita basis as well. Here's Baltimore. Baltimore schools spend the second most in the country on computer science and mathematics R&D, trailing only Pittsburgh. And still, the amount spent per resident, which is nearly $400,000 in the year 2000, fiscal year 2012, has increased over the last 3 years. So not only do we spend more than average, but we're growing our universities are growing their R&D expenditures in those cybersecurity related fields faster than average. So we're one of 10 metropolitan areas in this top right quadrant that is above average in both of those categories, and it's a good place to be in. And then, out of curiosity, there's also a look at federally financed university R&D. Baltimore's right there, the arrow. Story's totally the same. Number two overall in terms of per capita expenditures, and that's I should say that's residents of the region, not necessarily students at regional schools. So in terms of per capita expenditures, Baltimore's number two. Again, nearly $400,000 in computer science R&D per person, and again, growing faster over the last 4 years than the national average. when you look at this same graph on the state level, Maryland's right at the top. You can see it's head and shoulders above everywhere else. Almost $250,000 is spent per person at universities on computer science and mathematics R&D. Again, one of 10 states showing up in that top right-hand quadrant where you're both above average in per capita expenditure and change in expenditures over the last 4 years. And when you look at the federally financed one, just like Baltimore, it's mostly the same story. Head and shoulders above everybody else, spending a lot per capita on research in computer science and mathematics, and growing faster than average. Usually, when you see someone up this high, you'd almost expect them to be stagnant or slowing their expenditures every year. But schools in Maryland recognize the importance of cybersecurity, and they're terrific at educating future computer science and mathematics professionals. And they just recognize the importance of this R&D expenditure, both to educate students and to solve problems that exist in the industries. Baltimore and Maryland benefit from the presence of the federal government and the federal government's cybersecurity related agencies. For example, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the NSA, and Fort Meade are all located right in this area, and in between, in Baltimore and DC. While the Pentagon is just over the river in Washington, D.C. So we have all these intelligence agencies clustered all in the same area. And the other agencies that are not necessarily cybersecurity related in their mission, the NIH, for example, the FDA, certainly need cybersecurity solutions for their work. So it's not surprising then to see all of these pink dots around the area, which are the largest IT operations in the region. It's not surprising to see them clustered around the areas around the Pentagon, around Fort Meade, where they'd be able to quickly collaborate with people that are in their area, take advantage of that density, that benefit of agglomeration. So clearly Maryland and this Baltimore-Washington corridor is a favorable place for companies in the cybersecurity industry. As with any booming and growing ecosystem, there are a number of locally started and locally grown companies that embody the spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship. And Baltimore and Maryland are no different. We've got big successes like Tenable and SourceFire, which recently sold to Cisco, to those, quote, next big thing companies like LightPoint Security and CyberPoint, all the way down to the newer startups. There's a density among and a variety of cybersecurity industries that exist around this area. And that's great for for mentorship opportunities, again, for agglomeration and collaboration benefits. And it also means that there's continued waves of companies growing and getting bigger and getting very successful, and then allowing smaller operations to spin off or have a problem that might be so big it requires a new company to take care of. So having this mess of private industry companies that are in this cybersecurity and network security areas is definitely a big benefit, and it reaches farther out than just the government contractors that serve federally does. And to support those innovative and growing companies, there needs to be sort of an innovation infrastructure designed for them. The Baltimore-Washington corridor has that in spades. The Cyber Maryland Conference promotes idea sharing and creates even more density, at least for a couple days, as people come from all around the country to learn about and talk about what's going on in cybersecurity. And one of the coolest parts of this Cyber Maryland Conference, at least in my opinion, is the Maryland Cyber Challenge, which gives students a chance to show off their cybersecurity acumen and also see what it's like to be performing cybersecurity tasks, so to speak, in like a high pressure situation. It definitely helps them, get jobs after they graduate, and to see if this is an industry that they really want to chase down, and I think a lot of them do. There's also incubators like BW Tech, the CIC or the Chesapeake Innovation Center, and the ground floor that are specifically designed or have programs specifically for cybersecurity companies that either want to work with the federal government or, an APG, for example, at the ground floor, or Northrop Grumman at the BW Tech's Cyber Incubator Sync program. Um, it's not shown here as a logo, but there is a new federally funded R&D center being established through a partnership between UMBC, University of Maryland College Park, and the Meter Corporation, and that'll be stood up in Montgomery County, actually at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which is shown in the top right-hand corner. That'll be dedicated purely to cybersecurity R&D. And so while VC might be challenging, like we've said a couple of times, the Baltimore-Washington corridor and the state of Maryland has a number of state-funded, state-supported programs to help startups, get off the ground and help them, become funded. Specific cyber programs like the Cybersecurity Investment Tax Credit and the Employer Security are available here. I particularly like the Employer Security Clearance Cost Tax Credit. I think it's a really cool outside the box solution to. It's very expensive to get a new employee a security clearance. So for the state to be helping in that section, which is oftentimes a barrier to employment in the cybersecurity industry, I think is a very cool solution to a very real problem.
We also have a tax credit for the cost associated with building out a SCIF, which isn't. I think we maybe that's tied in under the ESCC, but I want to clarify there's also the security clearance side as well as the SCIF side.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Jeffrey. It is part of the ESCC, at least as far as I understood from how that program is operated. But yes, there is state support for building SCIFs. The Maryland Cybersecurity Fund is a $5 million specifically for cybersecurity companies, and the Orange Knox Cyber Fund, operated by TEDCO, maintains a portfolio of 15 to 25 cybersecurity companies at any given time. The
There's
Invest
also,
Maryland Challenge.
Go ahead. I just wanted to add to that. As of this year, the state has also funded through TEDCO a $1 million early stage cybersecurity investment fund. So they will invest up to $100,000 in very early stage cybersecurity products and service companies.
Terrific. And we said the Invest Maryland Challenge was accepting applications not too long ago, and there is a category specifically for information technology and defense companies, I believe is the official name for it, but that does include cybersecurity companies. So there is a way for the cybersecurity companies from around Maryland to enter this competition, get themselves some notoriety, be in the newspapers, and then win a $100,000 grant and a number of other business support packages as part of it. So some of the trends that we're seeing in cybersecurity that will be very important in the next 6 months to a year or so, like Jeffrey said, things change so rapidly and requirements for employment change so rapidly that we have to be mindful of what's coming up next in cybersecurity. The first that I want to point out is social engineering, which is really can be as simple as guessing someone else's password or having someone look over your shoulder at your screen as you're typing in your password or your code word to get into a bank account. That's being solved, at least at some level, with hardware changes. There's a company called Oculus that's over in the BW Tech incubator that is working on screen hardware that prevents people from seeing what's on your screen at various angles. Basically, you have to be sitting right in front of the computer to be able to see what's happening on the screen. But it's also important to educate users and not necessarily just heavy tech users or people in computer science fields. Everybody should know how to make a strong password and how to protect their online identities, so to speak. We also there's also a big push towards cloud computing. Um, it's very cost effective. It's very easy to be productive, and it's very convenient. Um, but again, like anything else, it needs to be protected. Uh, One intrusion potentially is more valuable than one intrusion in the past, because once you're in someone's cloud, you have access to potentially a number of their things. Some people store all of their passwords and logins just in their Dropbox account, for example. It's very important to be mindful of moving forward there. Cloud computing was a 149 billion dollar industry in 2014, just a 79 billion dollar industry in 2010. So you can see how quickly things are shifting, and how quickly an investment is being made in cloud computing. Companies want to have their things on the cloud. Makes sense. It allows people to work from remote locations, for example, and it allows software sharing and information sharing just over a company intranet. Um, but there are sometimes discrepancies in who is responsible for the information traveling from one computer to another, or from a server to a computer. So, in addition to this being a tech and security concern, it'll also be a policy concern in the not too distant future. And then finally, mobile computing and this Internet of Things, which is non-traditionally internet-based objects being on the internet. Everything from cars to washing machines to garage doors now have an internet connection, so you can turn them on when you're not home, or you can maintain them and keep an eye on them when you're not home, which makes people feel very high tech, very much like they're living in the future. And they're very cool things to be able to do, but there's also a security risk associated with that. In 2012, mobile devices eclipsed 20% of all web traffic for the first time. Um, and as you can expect, it's made them a target for malware and cyber breaches. In 2013, there were over 350,000 malware variants just specifically created for mobile devices. And to add some context there, just a few years prior, there were zero. So as that proliferation of smartphones, with your bank account information, your healthcare information, and even with the new Apple iPhone, how many tracks your health, and you have like the fitness tracker on your wrist. That information now is being stored on a mobile computer. So protecting that very strong, very important computer that's in your pocket is just as important, if not more important, perhaps, than protecting your workstation. There are new problems associated with this mobile computing as well. Some offices have bring your own device policies, which can create a challenge for an IT department as they're trying to protect both iPhones and Android phones and Windows phones and everybody's personal laptop all at the same time. There's also, like I said, new fitness trackers and new applications on smartphones that maintain your activity and healthcare data, and even your GPS location at all times. You've got cars with internet access, which have been hacked, at least in controlled environments, proving that it can be done, which means that they too need to be skipping desktops and going right to mobile phones. It's important to remember that the products that are made to protect mobile devices are not just going to be applicable to folks in Baltimore, folks in DC. It's going to have an impact around the world. So this is not only a tremendous industry and a tremendous opportunity now, but it'll be even bigger not too far in the future. So in Greater Baltimore and Maryland, we've shown that all the pieces are there for sustaining and growing a world-class cybersecurity industry. We've got tremendous geographic and infrastructure advantages, both infrastructure as relates to both actual travel infrastructure and both the sort of innovation infrastructure help for smaller companies. And those are big advantages. We also have a well-educated population, and our state is investing in the industry at every opportunity. But still, there's some work that needs to be done. We need to take advantage of private sector opportunity. We've got a tremendous healthcare industry here in Baltimore, a significant banking industry, and those industries, as they adopt more tech-friendly policies, they're also going to be needed to be protected as much as the networks of a high-tech firm are. Right now, the U.S. is the only country where government cybersecurity spending is equal to private sector cybersecurity spending. Typically, the private sector in every other country in the world spends about twice as much as their government does on cybersecurity protections. So the U.S. might be an outlier, might end up spending a little bit more from the government side than the private sector will. But it wouldn't surprise me to see the private sector start to spend more and more on cybersecurity protections in the next couple of years. We also need to focus on education. We talked about how many available jobs there are and what it would mean to fill those jobs for the area, for the region and the state. So we need to make sure we're educating the next generation of cybersecurity workers, both for the jobs that exist and for the jobs that don't actually exist yet, that are going to rely on technology and practices for home use among the non-tech savvy population. There also needs to be some growth in business support and financing. We need to attract more investment capital to remain competitive with those other dense cybersecurity markets. And we need to maintain the state's level of investment in those programs that we talked about, and Jeffrey pointed out a number of good ones. And then finally, because this is such a rapidly changing industry, we need to stay on top of new technologies and new trends. Being proactive in how we educate and what we focus our investment on and what we focus our company support on is going to go a long way towards making sure that we have an industry with a strong foundation. To turn this into a question and answer portion, I've got a couple of questions for Jeffrey right off the bat. If you have one as well, again, please type it into the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Jeffrey, I brought up a couple of areas that I thought I'd expect to see more cybersecurity in the recent future. And right now, it seems like everybody expects to have their online transactions protected as they maybe buy something from Walmart or Target online. But where else will we see
certainly
the average person
the retail environment has
information
captured
in their everyday
everyone's
lives in the
attention
next couple
and
of months or
perhaps
years?
imagination, and really opened the eyes to the average user about the concerns around cybersecurity. But the risks go well beyond just the transactions that we see happening in retail environments. And you mentioned several here in the report that I want to go back and touch that I think for those of you who are on here who've heard me speak before, cybersecurity is much more than securing things, and is as I've simply put it, it's anything with a microprocessor and electricity. But it really is about securing the data, the ones and zeros that make things happen. And so if you think about the ones and zeros that are out there that need to be secured, I think this Internet of Things, IoT, I actually want to call it the data of things because it's not always connected to the internet. But as we begin to see I was amazed at a conference 2 weeks ago to see the number of people wearing Fitbit or these health monitoring type devices. I've joked that my hearing aids can be hacked. We've had pacemakers be hacked. So these, anything that processes data or sends commands is at risk, and so those are great opportunities for Maryland companies to begin to address is securing the one and the zero, but also protecting Maryland's key sectors that you began to mention earlier as well, around bio, around health, protecting government, protecting manufacturing. All of those various sectors rely very heavily on ones and zeros moving either in a closed environment or between devices. It's not, as I've mentioned before, it's not always about the internet. It's just how things can communicate in many different ways, or even that the data sits at rest. And those 19,000 jobs, and certainly the 200,000 plus specialists that we have, and are beginning to lead the way. But what happens tomorrow and the threats of tomorrow to all of those sectors and to this data that is just going to be everywhere is incredibly important.
So recognizing the fact that there's going to be potentially a rapid shift in the types of information that needs to be protected, what do Greater Baltimore
Well, I
and the
think,
state
and
of
we've already
Maryland
begun this,
need to
certainly
do
when the
to
governor
adapt
started the
to
Cyber Maryland
an ever-changing
initiative in
cybersecurity industry?
2010, and was one of, well, the first and only governor to begin to recognize the DNA that Maryland had here in the state. An incredibly strong focus at the bachelor's degree, graduate degree levels. Those, we have 16 schools here in the state that are recognized as centers of excellence by the NSA. An incredible amount of resources that have been dedicated to producing graduates that can go into and serve, as I've mentioned before, typical cybersecurity types of jobs, which we're addressing really the government sector, is that is creating the student interest at a much earlier stage. And you had mentioned that we've got a great record here in the state of doing that, and I think we need to maintain this level of STEM programs, but also to include the a holistic approach to education by starting to begin to talk about STEM, STEAM. And so whether you're in an official STEM program or not, there are plenty of opportunities in the cyber ecosystem, because we need people that can solve problems using the technologies that are being developed. And I think that yes, I agree wholeheartedly both with the governor and Senator Mikulski, who have often said, one of our greatest asset here in the state are our people. And when it comes to cyber, it's not about technology. Those are just tools. We need people in the state that come out of our schools that we can attract from other states that are problem solvers to address the threats of tomorrow with technologies that we don't even know exist yet.
Can you share any examples of educational programs that are currently in place or soon to be in place that, like you said, are educating students early on and getting them interested in information assurance and cybersecurity, I guess early on in their educational
Sure.
careers, and
I mean, there
building the
are
foundation for
at many of
a strong
the
cyber
local
workforce in the
high
future?
schools, in addition to the STEM programs, they have a lot of the programs that have been created either by very interested teachers or family members that have been able to begin to show that interest, but programs that have been funded by the National Science Foundation, CyberWatch, and Cool Cyber Jobs for Girls are some great examples of that. This new federally funded program that goes along with our Department of Labor licensing and regulation work, both at that is I think 19 million dollars that go to 15 Maryland colleges, as well as the CyberWorks program, which was an extension of the EARN program that Dollar had, that works to really develop this next generation of cyber students, but also the cyber curriculum to go with that. I think you highlighted, and I think we were number one if we go back and look at those slides, that we are are a great school at really in investing into the programs that happen at the schools. And in addition to our traditional schools of higher learning, the UMBC, UMUCs, Johns Hopkins, which are internationally recognized. It's very interesting to see that our community college and some of our smaller colleges here in the state are nationally recognized. I was in Israel recently, and Anne Arundel Community College is internationally recognized as a leader in developing next generation cybersecurity problem solvers. So I think that the concentration of federal funds and grants, as well as the commitment by the O'Malley administration and the leadership from various community organizations, as well as our various educational organizations, is really developing these these thought leaders that are going to be able to solve problems here in the future. And probably many of you are sick of hearing me say that. If you solve problems, jobs and revenue get created. If you don't, you get something very similar to what happens in other states, which are booms and busts. And Maryland has always been at the forefront of solving problems.
So changing topics just slightly, but since you brought up the creating jobs and solving problems, we didn't necessarily talk about it as much during this report. But Maryland is very highly ranked in innovation and entrepreneurship and does a tremendous job of research and solving those problems, like you said. But sometimes fails to match up that rate of innovation with a similar rate of commercialization. So how can we improve that state's ability to move new technologies and new ideas into, I guess, a marketplace and build businesses around them, and just in general in the
Sure, and,
cybersecurity
and I'll
industry,
challenge
does
you. I'll say
the
that
top
not that
secret
we
nature of some of this
failed.
work
I don't
affect
think
the
we
ability
have.
of the
I
technology to ever
think
see
that
the
it has
private market?
been the process is very long and arduous, traditionally because of what you mentioned there at the very end. That most of the work that was done in cybersecurity, really up until about 13 months ago, was focused on, you know, Department of Defense, intelligence, and sort of national security types of products and services. And so, commercializing the that work is very difficult when it's classified in nature. What has happened in really the last 13 months and we talked about this earlier, across the globe, people are beginning to focus on what is at risk in cyber. Certainly, the retailers have started to learn this. The banking industry is scared to death, most of all, as well as the critical infrastructure providers. Those that provide energy are very concerned. So the commercial opportunities for cyber-related products as well as services are really starting to ramp up. And I think that you're going to begin to see the commercialization track that because it's easier. The barriers to entry into market, as well as the intellectual property transfer, is going to be much easier. But I think as another thing that will assist that you touched on earlier as well is, we have the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which is focused on commercial standards, and you'll have the FFRDC, or the Federally Funded Research and Development Center there at the NCCOE. You're going to have the many of our incubators here in the state, as well as our colleges, that are now able to really approach a new market, or at least solving problems in a new way, that are going to create commercialization of these technologies and of them as well. I hope I answered your question.
No, you did. You definitely did a terrific job of answering that question. Last question from me, and the last question overall, unless there's anything from our attendees. I wanted to give you the floor to talk about some of the things that the state of Maryland is doing, aside from creating this unparalleled workforce, to make the state more appealing for people looking to start a cybersecurity company or relocate their cybersecurity company to somewhere that it could really grow to its greatest potential.
Yeah, well, you mentioned some of these earlier. We have the cyber investment tax credit, which is very unusual, and actually I haven't looked at this in over a month, but as of up to a month ago, no other state had one that looked like ours, which gives the credit back to the company instead of to the investor, which really helps reinvest in much needed capital into the growth of companies. We touched on the TEDCO fund, which helps very, very early stage companies that need that starter capital of $25,000 to $100,000 or less to get them moving. You talked about the Cyber Maryland, or excuse me, the Invest Maryland Challenge, but also the Maryland Venture Fund has set aside $5 million. I think we've got 13 companies at the moment that are in that that have helped that process. We've also really since January, since RSA, built some very strong relationships with West Coast-based venture capital firms, as well as technologists that are looking for the next big thing in cyber. And a lot of the things I just mentioned are really going to culminate, starting tomorrow evening and then ending Thursday evening at the Cyber Maryland conference, which is very different than the conferences we've done in the past. I hesitate sometimes to even call it a conference as much as it is several conferences taking place at the same time. So we're up until this week, there have been 200, based on the counts that I've looked at, 263 cybersecurity related conferences around the country. And most of those were focused on very technical aspects of cybersecurity and on things that we already know about cybersecurity. This conference has multiple tracks that address the very interesting aspects of cyber that are important. One is, what is the business of cyber, both from the commercial perspective as well as from the services or government perspective? There's a very another mini conference, if you will, that's focused on providing a picture or the ability to visualize a career and a future for in education for students in cybersecurity. We also have very tightly integrated in this event is a job fair that is not just about coming and dropping off your resumes, but it's about coming and really learning about companies that are actually hiring, learning, having interviews, learning how to interview, learning how to write resumes, and having some dynamic speakers around what are the opportunities, whether you have a clearance or not in this particular space. We've got sort of another mini conference that's focused on innovation and entrepreneurship, where to find money, how to grow, how to do that strategically, the services that we offer here in the state, but also how to accelerate your growth, whether that be attracting folks from other parts of the country to come fill the vacancies that we have. And another, is really focused on operations, which is what are the challenges, the cyber issues of tomorrow. And so our thought, many of our leaders that exist here in the state are recognized thought leaders around the world for solving cyber problems. But if we didn't have one, we found them from other parts of the world and brought them in to really make this a center for discussion. So the idea is, no matter what role you have in life, a student looking for another career, whether you're a CSO, whether you're in the manufacturing business, whether you're in unmanned vehicle maintenance or development or research and development, or a cybersecurity company looking for money, or someone looking to invest. No matter who you are in any of those, hopefully, if you're awake, you leave this conference with some action items and some sort of value created for you during that. And I think that really is a culmination of the hard work that so many people in the state have done over the last 4 or 5 years. I just kind of get to talk about it.
Terrific. Thank you, Jeffrey. It's always a terrific conference, very productive, and like you said, a lot of people leave with action items, and it sounds like it just keeps getting better year after year. So I'm excited. I'm excited to go this year, and I hope all of our attendees are going to be there as well. So with that, if
Well,
there's
and I
no other
think
questions,
the last numbers, I'm sorry, I was just going to say, it's interesting. The last numbers I saw were about 800 people have registered so far online, and it's a great mix. We got folks that are in government, that are in commerce, that are in education. We have a great number of veterans that are looking to transition from the military into jobs. So it's we've got a nice mix, and I'd say this is one of the largest registration numbers that we've seen prior to the conference. There's always folks who come in and last minute, but this is some great numbers.
terrific. I'm very glad to hear that. Well, if there's no other questions, I'm going to leave you all with my contact information in case you'd like to get in touch about this presentation or about either of the reports that we talked about today. I'd also like to provide you links to the EAGB website, our cybersecurity market report, and our fall quarterly economic update, the two presentations that we discussed today. So feel free to log on and download those from our website. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thanks everyone for joining.